Hi, and welcome to Kegels and Coffee. My name is Isabel, and I'm your host. My friend Janet and I met in Boulder in 2012 and have been close friends ever since. Both her parents, first-generation immigrants from Taiwan, came to the U.S. during the early 80s. Her dad went to the University of Chapel Hill for his master's in electrical and computer engineering, and then was offered a job at Hewlett-Packard in Fort Collins, where Janet was born. In our conversation, Janet talked about what it felt like to grow up as a minority within the white world of the Front Range, where classmates mistaked her adopted friends from Korea as her siblings. Her older sister's nickname was The Brain, and hers, the Little Brain. Janet grew up speaking English and Mandarin Chinese, Taiwan's official language. Now, Taiwanese schools also teach the regional dialect, and political speeches are actually written in Taiwanese. There's a growing younger generation who is yearning for more independence and a stronger push to claim a national identity. Janet gives us the lay of the land of Taiwan, a beautiful island off the coast of China, also known as an important manufacturing hub, producing the most high-tech, cutting-edge computer chips, which has also led to difficult dynamics with China and the U.S. Janet knows what it means to be an outsider, not only in the U.S., but also in China. After graduating from college, at age 22, she took her very first job, moved to Hong Kong, and became the liaison between American design engineers and Chinese manufacturing engineers for the Roomba robotic vacuum cleaner. What she didn't realize before arriving is that she was going to be the only woman on the team. Janet shares with us some outrageous stories of gender discrimination and harassment during her time in China. When she returned to the U.S., she became a teaching professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at the University of Colorado Boulder. In this role, she advocates for women and students from marginalized groups to pursue interests related to engineering and technology. She has tried to use her own experiences of gender and race discrimination as motivation to keep going and inspiration to show younger students that things can be different. We also talked about how the deep-seated work ethic of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps does not really encourage a person to speak up, but rather bite their tongue and get through it. In order for things to change, we need to have a conversation, which starts with giving a voice to those who experience gender and race discrimination in engineering and science. Janet also touched upon how important it is for engineers to feel responsible for their technologies and designs. It is one thing to create a robot and another to allow a third party to attach a gun to it. In her own words, being an engineer is a fun way to see the world, but I wish a lot of times that we connected more to the world. I truly hope this episode helps bring awareness to a conversation we must have. Janet is an inspiration to me, and I think you will see why. To learn more about her, please refer to the links in the show notes. Enjoy.
No, seriously, what am I doing with my life?
How did that come across? Did they hear me?
I feel like I'm losing my fucking mind.
You're messed up.
I need to just Netflix and chill.
Like, I'm gonna meditate like a badass.
It's just like this psychotic break, and then I get my period, and I'm like, oh, it was just your period again.
Am I the only one feeling this crazy? So here we are. Thanks for sitting with me and recording. I really appreciate it. And you've been such a dear friend to me for so many years. I mean, basically since I've been in Boulder.
Yeah, I think we were lucky to meet each other many years ago.
Yeah.
And then to start hanging out.
We've gone through some shit together.
Yes.
I can say that. But yeah, I want to start with actually giving just a little bit of a layout of the landscape of what is going on. So your parents are from Taiwan, and I want to talk about your story. And also I feel like it's helpful to have just a little bit of an idea of the political dynamics that are happening right now between Taiwan and China and obviously the U.S. And would you give us a little
Sure. I will do the
layout?
best that I can. So Taiwan is a small island off the coast of China. you know, and the big history is that like in 1949, there was a communist revolution in China. And at that point, the nationalists, who are sort of the traditional government of Taiwan, fled the communist revolution because if they had stayed, then they would have been ousted from power. And a lot of them actually ran to Taiwan. So Taiwan has always had this different identity because it's had all these people who are explicitly trying to fight back against, you know, Mao Zedong, sort of this like communist regime of power. However, ever since they kind of moved to Taiwan, China has always believed that they're still in charge. And so when people say the one China policy, that's China saying, we are only one country and everything that's loosely affiliated with us should be governed by China. No independent self-governance. And so you see this in places like Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan are all interesting examples. Right. Those are all small kind of islands that are geographically close to China and, you know, share Chinese ancestry, you know. However, you know, it's complicated. Like Taiwan has Aboriginal peoples, native peoples that have also been displaced from their lands as a result of like Chinese migrants, you know. Taiwan, the island, has a complicated history where it's been occupied. So you can think about it being occupied by China. You can think about it being occupied by Japan for many years. Right. And then that's why it has this kind of interesting identity that it does now, you know. So Taiwan itself, you know, is a beautiful island. In Portuguese, it was called Formosa, which means beautiful island. Wow. You know? Yeah, we talked about the Tropic of Cancer runs right through the middle of the island. So it's kind of like tropical, you know? Yeah. It's also very industrialized. You know, it's this manufacturing hub, particularly for semiconductors, chips, you know, and so those are very much in the news right now with this chip shortage that we have in the US. Right. The best chips come from Taiwan. They've been really good and very focused at improving their manufacturing capabilities to do the most cutting edge, like high tech, chips, which makes it a really important strategic manufacturing area for the world, right? And specifically for the United States. Mm-hmm. Interestingly, you know, Taiwan also, they're home for these really like niche industries. So high-end bike components are also manufactured in Taiwan, you know, and it's changed over the years. You know, I think like in the 90s and 80s, it's like cheap goods were made in Taiwan. And then a lot of that actually got shifted to mainland China. And so now Taiwan is more known for, I think, like, yeah, some of these fancy industries like semiconductors work. And
yeah, absolutely. Exactly. Thank you for that. And so the tensions that are currently going on between China and Taiwan, one thing that you mentioned is that there's also a shifting of, you know, political affiliation when we speak about the generations in Taiwan, that the younger generation is yearning for more independence. And you had also mentioned that growing up, you were supposed to speak Mandarin, not Taiwanese. And is that shifting?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of things that have happened, I think. Yeah. So right now, I think there's a lot of awareness about Taiwan because it's in the news all the time, right? And so recently, Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, you know, and then there's been all this press coverage about like, oh, how is China going to respond to this? And so China has responded by doing all these like military drills in the Taiwan Strait, which is just the small band of water that separates Taiwan, the island, from the coast of China. And it's like, okay, so we have all these heightened tensions, partially because of like what's happening in Ukraine, as well as just like seeing the state of the world, you know, and thinking about all these suspicions, I would say, that the U.S. has had towards China that have been building and building and building over the last like 10 years, you know. Right. Very recently, there's been all these like Chinese academic scientists and engineers whose research has become questioned as to if they're also like conducting espionage for China, you know, like this very high profile guy, just read this article. He was arrested because they thought he was like selling all of his technology to China, but he was recently like vindicated and he just released some fancy finding that like his group has the best semiconductor material of all time, you know, so he's still doing science, but it's like, yeah, it's become very complicated. And I know some Chinese colleagues here in the US feel like they're under suspicion at all times. And especially it's
so
really complicated,
intense.
right? Because they have family in China, and it's like we want as scientists and engineers to be able to collaborate, right? And there's no reason that we shouldn't be able to share information, knowledge, technology, except that actually it's becoming very political, you know?
Wow.
But back to your question about sort of these different generations in Taiwan, you know, they do these polls all the time to ask the Taiwanese population, you know, do you support complete Taiwan independence? Or on the flip side, the other end of the spectrum is like, do you support reunification with China? Okay. And I think over the years, there's been these shifts as far as what percentages of the Taiwanese population are along which extreme. And so the majority of Taiwanese citizens want things to stay the way they are, which is this very strange, middle ground, right? Where actually the UN, United Nations, cannot recognize Taiwan as an independent nation because that will make China really mad.
Right.
And so even in the Olympics, for instance, Taiwan does not compete under its own flag. It's not allowed to.
Wow.
But so there's this loophole where they compete under, I think, the name Chinese Taipei, right?
Interesting.
There's only one or two countries that are willing to recognize Taiwan as a independent nation, right? Most people cannot, including the US. However, because like we talked about, there's all the strategic importance to Taiwan, there's some idea that there's like a US safety net a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That
But
they
so-
would protect them.
Yes.
Yes.
But then I think, so many generations of Taiwanese citizens have seen their country occupied by different people, and so I think I told you my father's eldest brother grew up speaking Japanese because the island was under Japanese occupation at that time.
Yeah.
And so it's very common for that generation to speak Japanese, right? But the younger generation, I think partially because of the internet, partially just because of the way people can share information so freely now and can also be aware of sort of what's happening in the world on a level that maybe was much harder in the past.
Right.
And I think everyone's seeing what has happened to Hong Kong in the last, 5 to 10 years, meaning that, China has slowly started to exercise their force more and more over Hong Kong.
Yeah.
And Hong
You were
Kong
saying that
similarly used to be
yesterday.
like a super, unique place, which was governed by the British for 100 years, right? And then they had to give it back to China. And at first, when the handover happened, where, the UK gave Hong Kong back to China, China had said, oh, no, we're going to leave Hong Kong alone because it has a unique economy. It's a special, economic zone. It has its stock market. It has a very, prominent place of economic importance. But, gradually what they've been doing is jailing all the dissidents, putting down all the protests, not allowing people to speak out against what they think is unfair treatment. There's been all these protests. One of the early ones was about an extradition bill where they basically, Hong Kong was saying, if you're in Hong Kong, you should be allowed to have different types of political freedoms and basically free speech, and China's saying no, you're not allowed to do that. And in fact, we are allowed to take people across borders, right? To say they can chase down criminals who would try to escape to Hong Kong, basically, which was really controversial. People didn't want to approve it, but then, all this stuff happened. But basically we see now that China is much more in control of Hong Kong than they said that they were going to be.
Right.
Yeah. And I think that makes Taiwan, arguably they've always had a different position. But now it's more fraught depending on who you listen to about their political power and what's likely to happen in the future.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Thank
So as a
you.
result of all this, the Taiwanese independence movement has sort of been gaining steam over the years. And a big change since the time that I was growing up was that now political speeches are all made in Taiwanese. I think there's been a stronger push to claim this national identity, and language is one way to do that, right? And so it's for a while, so I grew up in the 80s and the 90s, but my parents thought that, it's going to be much better preparation for you to speak Mandarin Chinese because that's the national language, that goes everywhere. That's what was taught in schools at that point. And now they're saying, oh, well, actually, you have to know both. You have to know the formal and national government language, but also it's important to know the regional dialect. And Taiwanese people are using it to kind of rally around being this is our language, this is our identity. It's separate and different, right, than the mainland China language and the government language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much for this. I feel like that is really helpful to have that entire background just as a landscape and diving into your story. So as you just mentioned, you grew up in Fort Collins in the 80s and 90s, and your parents had immigrated, I believe you said in 1981 or something like this, because your dad was accepted at the university.
Yeah.
And so he was in Chapel Hill first, but then ended up in Fort Collins.
Exactly. Yeah. So my dad came to the U.S. to do a master's, I think, in electrical and computer engineering. And it's funny. So he was at UNC Chapel Hill when Michael Jordan was, right?
Wow.
But he didn't go to any basketball games.
So you never actually got to see him.
Yeah, but it's cool that they were there at the same time,
is pretty cool. Very
and then
unique.
he got a job offer from Hewlett Packard, which was like one of these original computer companies, you know? And so he took that job and moved to Fort Collins, Colorado. And so my mom and my sister moved there in like 1983. Which I always think is very interesting. 'Cause it's like, how much did they think about what it would be like to live in Colorado, you know?
Right.
Yeah.
And in a city that's, demographically speaking, mostly white.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. Maybe it was not so much about what is it going to be like, but rather the opportunity, right? Like the job.
No, exactly. And I think
Yeah.
HP at that point was known as being like a really great company. A lot of people worked there for like, their whole careers, their whole lives, and they like were very proud of sort of their like company culture and all this stuff.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
So I think in some sense it was kind of like exactly what my dad wanted to do,
Exactly.
and it worked out well. I think that my mom was excited to like live in this area. She did a degree then at the university in Fort Collins. And then I was born in 1984.
Yeah, and that is something that I wanted to ask you now. What was it like? What was it like to grow up there?
A big thing. So I happen to have these two friends who are twins who are adopted Koreans. Okay. And the three of us were the only Asians in our elementary school for like all, 6 years of elementary school or whatever. But to the point that all of our classmates, they usually thought that I was related to them,
Wow.
because even though we don't look anything alike, right? It was just this
they
assumption.
assumed. Wow.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that that's maybe one way to describe just like how different
Yeah.
we looked. And so as a result, they just assumed that we were all like, sisters. But it worked out in my favor sometimes. Like I could sneak into their neighborhood pool all the time, right? Because I'd just be like, yeah, sure, I'm part of their family, even though like, like no
So
one's
that
gonna
means
call
I
out,
get to
like, a
use
kid
your
on
pool
that.
now.
Yeah, exactly.
That's awesome.
But I just remember all those kids on the playground being like, go stand next to your sister, and it's like, she's not my sister.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes. And so growing up, I think basically it's like being Asian was like part of my identity because it was very much like that's how I was differentiated from other people in Fort Collins. You know?
It's like the mind needs to have categories.
Right.
It's such a human thing, and here's a category, and that's who you are.
Right.
And you were mentioning that you were kind of a nerd, but that it was like fine because it was almost like expected of an Asian person to be a nerd.
Yes, exactly. And so my sister's 4 years older than me, and I remember in like she was in sixth grade, I was in second grade, and their class was like our reading buddies or something, and her nickname in her grade was like the brain.
Oh my God.
Which was then funny because then they were our reading buddies. So then my nickname was the little brain. I'm like, I don't think that's complimentary. But I just think that we were typecast as being like studious, and like I had glasses and so did my sister. So of course we're going to like look like nerds, But also, I mean, when I was in high school, like I didn't want to adhere to that stereotype necessarily, especially because my dad was an engineer. Like I really actually did not want to be an engineer because I thought that what he did was like, first of all, I had no idea. My sister and I would visit him at his work and it was just like a cubicle farm, whereas like you have a computer and I guess you sit at it, but like I have no idea what you actually do.
Right.
Right. And it just looked like kind of weird and boring. So I was like, oh, I don't think I'm going to do that at all. But when I was in high school, I had a math teacher who was also the robotics team coach, and so every day in math class, he would like tell us what was going on with the robotics team. And eventually he convinced me to stop by after school one day, And so sure enough, I stopped by after school one day and it's like, oh, wow, like this is really cool. Like, oh, I like what they're doing. Oh, I understand. Like, they're building a robot, and like, wow, this looks really fun. And that environment ended up being like really important for me, really nurturing. Like I ended up spending all my time with the robotics team, like doing all this stuff with them, like leading the team towards my like later years of high school. And then that really like set me on this trajectory to study engineering in college, and to like care about robots, right? And to always want to build robots. So that's really what I thought that my like whole career goal was gonna be.
Is build robots.
Yeah, exactly. Until I did build robots for a while, and then was like, oh, actually, maybe I don't want to do this.
But you have been still part of these competitions, and you've
Yes.
won a prize. It's hanging up there.
Yes. Well, and so this is another long story, right? But yeah, I've been part of this robotics organization for like over 20 years, in various
Incredible.
ways. Yeah, since the time I was in high school to then like mentoring to then, helping out with other teams and trying to like help young students get started. When I did it as a high school student, I didn't see all the problems in sort of like the culture of this robotics program and in how it's set up. Since then, I think I've been a pretty vocal critic of a lot of the just norms of American sports that they've tried to put into robotics competitions. And it was with good intentions, like the designers of, it's called the For Inspiration and Recognition of Science and Technology program, or the FIRST robotics competition, it's their acronym. They thought, oh, if we make this more mainstream, then it will be cool for kids to get involved and want to be on the robotics team,
okay.
And I think that they did a lot to like legitimize it as an after school activity, and so students like in my high school, you could letter in robotics, right? It's like, so you're not going to letter in like varsity football,
right.
But you can letter in like varsity robotics. Okay. Which is, I think, a cool idea,
Yeah.
but like in practice, I think it makes their competitions, still, they can't have different norms than like American sports do then, right?
Right.
And so like you're still expecting the same things. Like they want you to bring like your mascots and your cheerleaders and like all this stuff. And you're like, do we really need that to be like a winning robotics team? Yeah, but so that competition I think has shown me a lot about the interesting details and the importance of like, a thoughtful culture to really get different kinds of people involved in whatever the activity is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there are some ways, the American ways, that's really funny.
Yeah. Well, and it's still like the thing about the robotics program that drives me nuts is, they want young people to get involved in engineering of like all genders, races, whatever. But at the same time, it's like you go to this competition, you see who's driving the robots, and it's like still 90% like high school boys, right? And it's like, hey, I'm not blind. I can see this.
Yes.
And yet, like, a lot of people did not seem to think that that was an issue until like pretty recently.
Yeah,
and it's
I know.
been very,
And that's
like,
something that I
obvious.
felt so flabbergasted by. I mean, I've known you for so many years now, 2012 or something. And over the years, I've heard stories of, working with other students or, your interactions with supervisors. And it's so mind-blowing sometimes to realize that we're really still in it. We're really, when we talk about gender and when we talk about race, we really actually need to talk about it, and everybody's scared to talk about it. And like, I feel like there's a hesitance and like there's like the political correctness around it and these walls. And it's like, but these things need to be told, these things need to be mentioned, because I feel like your experience in your department, which is something I would like to get to eventually, is like, when you discovered engineering for yourself and realized, wow, this is actually something I feel passionate about, like that process, as you said, eventually going to study engineering. And then you mentioned to me earlier that then being Asian was a different experience because in university there were so many Asian people, correct?
Yeah. And so more context, I guess, engineering is still male dominated. My field specifically of mechanical engineering remains about like 20% women or less. Which is crazy because like the government in the U.S. has pumped like billions of dollars into trying to diversify the field since like the 1970s.
Wow.
But basically it's been really hard to attract women to some of these engineering fields, particularly mechanical.
Yes.
And if you think about the image of mechanical engineering, it is like cars, You know, it's like bro-y,
Yeah.
you know? And I think that that's fun, but I also think that I've like conditioned myself to think that in some ways, you know? So yeah, exactly. Going back to my story, it's like, so in high school, I was part of the robotics team and I didn't ever really feel judged or weird because already in high school, I was weird already. You know, I was already kind of a nerd. I was already in this academic program, you know, so I didn't feel like it was strange at all for me to be doing these activities. In college, I went to this selective engineering school that was brand new in its first year of existence. So they selected for 50-50 gender balance, men and women, you know?
Wow.
But what's really interesting is when we got there, you know, I assumed that means, okay, we all got here, you know, like we all must be equal enough to like go to school here, right?
It should be good. I mean, the
Yes.
intention is good.
Yes. But I stumbled across, like, I remember these students in the dorm lounge and they were like making a list of who they thought the smartest people in the school were. And so this is a thing that now I know engineers do, particularly boys or men, I can say, who are like 18 years old, who just graduated at the top of their class in high school and are thrown into the mix in college, right? They try to figure out, like, how do I fit in here? And I think for some people, how they try to understand how they fit in is literally through like making a list. Okay.
Oh my God.
And so like, okay, I look at their list of like, who do they think is smart, right? And out of these 10 people, you know, there's only 2 women, I think, and like 8 dudes. And I remember like the dudes on the list are these guys who, okay, I'm just going to stereotype here, but you know, you can picture the guy in your lecture who like asks a question not because he actually has a question, but because he's like trying to show off how much he knows, right?
Right.
And there's some men who have this ability to like phrase these questions in a way that shows like, oh, I am so smart.
I know all these things.
Exactly, right? But I always thought it's like, that doesn't mean they're actually smart, right? That just means that they're trying to like satisfy something in them, you know, that needs this public display and like reassurance that like you are smart or whatever, you know? But what also frustrated me was these men were continuing to like explain, you know, the demographics of our school in these really problematic ways. Because what they were saying was like, oh, we have 50-50 men and women here at this school. We know many more men applied than women did, you know. So it must mean that it was easier for the women to get in. So they would then jump to the conclusion like, oh, that means that the women here don't belong here, don't deserve to be here as much as the men do.
Oh my God, that is so fucked up. It's like it counter the whole idea.
Yes.
Ugh,
Exactly.
So frustrating.
And so this is me at 18 years old and being like, this is funny. Because like literally that never came up in high school for me, right? But then it's like here in college, even though it's 50-50 men and women, that's like the first thing that's coming up is all these guys saying like, oh, it was so easy for you to get in because you're a girl. Like you don't really belong here, you know? So that made me really mad because then it showed me like, oh, I kind of always had this eye towards like fairness, I think. And immediately I'm like, this is dumb. And especially like we're supposed to build this school and this is their attitude of how they're starting out is like discounting half of us. Like this is not going to work, you know? But there I thought it was really interesting how I felt like my gender was more important as far as people judging me than my race was, right? Because it was also in Boston, and so there was a lot more Asians there. And I think for me, it was also complicated to be like, oh, you know, my whole existence up until this point, I've been in such like a white-dominated society that being Asian was the thing that made me stand out. But now in college, it's like, oh, there's lots of Asians. That's not like my distinguishing characteristic anymore.
It was gender.
Well, except there's lots of women around too. But it's just like, you know, I think in college, everyone has to redefine who they are and like figure out what actually matters to them, you know? But for me, it was a big step to be like, oh, if I'm not by default like the Asian one, because there's lots of Asians, you know, it's like, then who am I?
Right.
And in that sense, it was like, oh, I'm the one from Colorado, right? And I think it's like very simplistic, but like, you know, first year college freshmen, like people are needing to figure out how they fit in and how they're going to sort out, you know?
And how to place each other almost,
Yes. Except some people choose to do it in this weird ranking way, right? And others choose to do it as far as like, you know, what kind of person are you?
Right.
You know?
Exactly.
One more thing about that list. What's disturbing to me is I've heard that this actually happens over and over and over again. You know, after my year, I was so mad. I'm like, this is so dumb. I like took it to the college leadership. I talked to the dean of students about it. I wrote an article about it. You know, it's like, there's all this stuff. And yet it happens again and again and again. Right. And even I had a mentee who was at the school a first year last year, and she told me about a very similar thing happening in her year too. And it just shows me like this is so pervasive, this need to like rank and for these people to have their identities reassured, like, oh, you're still smart, don't worry, you know? And it's all is still gender imbalanced.
That is so wild that is still happening. And it makes me think about like, okay, you know, not being a professor and not being in that engineering department, but hearing your stories, you know, through being a professor in this department, it just makes me feel like, okay, the go-to, how can we fix this, is like the leaders need to be leaders. The people that are in touch with these students need to be leaders in the way that we're trying to move to, you know. And that's something that I have always admired so much about you when you've talked about your work over the years and moving into this department and accomplishing what you have, which is incredible. And I've seen your drive and your passion around, you know, talking about how can we, you know, improve our curriculum? How can we make this accessible? How can we make this inclusive? How can we connect? And how can we be relatable to these students that come in thinking that it's going to be this thing, but they don't know what it's going to be? And also like to connect with the female students. And I've always appreciated so much your passion behind it and your willingness, like you said, you know, to speak up, whether it is through an article, whether it is through communicating within the department or at a meeting. Do you feel like you've bumped up against, you know, challenges or just like abrasive moments because of that?
Sure. But I also think, you know, it shows me a lot that it's not so much even what we tell people, because it's like we can tell them all day long, like, oh, these are the things, like the reason the women deserve to be here equally as much was because there's already all this like self-selection bias that goes into it. You know, like by the time a woman in high school clicks a box that says, oh, I'm interested in engineering, it already means that she's like gone through so much stuff to get there, right? Whereas a lot of men who apply, it's like they had someone tell them that, oh, you should just give it a shot, right? Or like, oh, I think you'd be good at this. Or their guidance counselor says that to them in ways that probably they don't say to women, you know? But it's funny because it's just like so pervasive, you know, and then people, regardless of the messaging, they come in with their own attitudes. And I think it's still, you know, there's been documentaries and stuff about this. If you're asked to picture a scientist, you know, it's like, even who do you picture? And for me, it's like, oh, I probably still picture like a white man in a lab coat, you know?
Yeah.
Despite the fact that like I know so many women in science and I really believe that like the image should change, you know, that's still like the default image in my head.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah, leadership is one thing. I think like policies and action are super important, but it's so like pervasive, these assumptions and these images that we have about who we expect to be engineers and scientists, you know?
It seems just like a very slow process because, as you said, there has been money poured into this intention, and still these lists are being made.
Yes.
It's like, where is the progress? Where is the progress, actually?
Right. And so it's been a wild time to be like a diversity researcher in technology and education and engineering, you know? So like 2020, I think, really made at least big tech companies publicly need to acknowledge their limitations as far as diversity. And so now, like, you know, all the big tech companies, Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon, they have to release their demographics. And that was a big step because it's like you have to be able to count the people and know how different these distributions are, you know, before you can start to like set goals and try and do something about them.
Right.
You know? And so since then it's like, okay, we know what the stats are, and it's like, you know, there's not a lot of women in leadership positions. Sometimes there's more women at the lower levels. And then the issues with with race are more complicated. But yeah, where is the progress? It's like, it's there kind of, but also it's not necessarily huge sometimes.
Right.
There's lots of initiatives, you know, there's lots of people that are like trying to do things to, help gender parity, or at least make some of these climates more welcoming to all kinds of people. But I think the problem is a lot of times people in power don't actually know what to do. Right. And in some cases they're not actually listening. You know?
Right. This is something I feel like you've also experienced.
For sure. Yeah. And I think people nowadays are savvy enough to know that they have to be careful in what they say, you know? And I remember when I was in college, I think in 2004, the then president of Harvard University was this famous economist named Larry Summers, who then went on to work in the Obama administration, I think, and do a bunch of other stuff. But he publicly said in this meeting that he was like, oh, what if there's like a biological reason that women are not cut out for science?
Oh my God.
You know, and then he got roasted for it. Eventually he had to resign his presidency, even though he was like, oh, I was just playing devil's advocate. You know, that quote was taken out of context, blah, blah, blah. But, you know, he was still comfortable saying something like that in a public meeting in 2004. And so at least maybe it's progress now that like, oh, my college president would not say that, right? Would not speculate on a biological reason why like women are not cut out for certain types of things. But I think the question is, do some people still believe that?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's, I think, the problem, really.
Yes.
It doesn't matter if somebody says it or not. What are the people actually thinking?
Right. And in some cases, I think people hold these beliefs about like what is merit, what is achievement, what is intelligence, and they don't realize how damaging it can be for then what they put forth in their classrooms,
Right.
you know, and kind of like what norms are they actually setting, you know? So yeah, I teach at the University of Colorado Boulder in the mechanical engineering department, and I observe sometimes these large lecture courses. And so even as recently as like, 2015, I sat in on a big class of like 100 students. The students who are willing to ask questions in that really intense lecture hall environment, they're still largely men and white, you know? And it's like, geez, it seems like we should have made some more progress by now.
Yes.
And it seems like it's something that is so glaringly obvious, like who is actually comfortable speaking up and asking a question in this class, right? And it ends up being sometimes such a limited demographic that it's like, man, how can we even pretend like our educational system is fair when it's like, who is actually accessing these resources, publicly?
Yeah, and I guess like if I imagine myself being the teacher standing in front of all of these students, that I would want to find a way to say like, anybody that has a question, like please ask, raise your hand, this is what I'm here for. And I mean, I'm sure that that's what they do, but just like as a teacher, that's like the best that you can do is try to like, reach out and
Sure.
and connect. And I feel like that is something that you do really well. I mean, I've seen and heard the stories about, your students even giving you feedback on how they appreciate how you've presented material or like integrated them and made them inclusive.
Yeah. I think I've had many students who are just thankful that I am not white and that I'm not a man, because there's so few, people like that in prominent positions in engineering faculty right now, I also think it's like, I don't expect every student to want to ask a question in public,
Right.
And so like we build in all these other ways where it's like, oh, here's this anonymous message board, here's this other way to leave a comment, here's a way to come up after class or during office hours, right? It's like, sure, all these avenues I think are very important because people do want to learn in different ways and ask questions in different ways,
Absolutely.
But at the same time, it's just always like, what is the default,
Mm-hmm.
And recently there's been like some stuff I've been reading really that's like at a lot of colleges, we have this assumed default like campus identity, and it's like same idea. If you picture a CU Boulder student, like who do you picture? Right. And there is a whole set of stereotypes and assumptions that go along with that. But then there's this idea that, okay, if we know, even if we don't want to, we have that sort of like default campus identity, then anyone who isn't that identity is going to feel the pain of like not fitting in, right? Or feeling like, oh, this place was not actually designed for me. Or like, oh, most of these people here are caring about like football, like partying, like doing all this stuff. And for students who don't, I think they can have some sort of like dissonance to be like, oh, like, is my identity equally as valid? Like where do I fit in on, if not a SMART list, then like a CU Boulder list,
Yeah, where is my part in this? Like feeling easily just like an outsider and not part of the actual experience of the campus life.
Yes.
That's so interesting. What was your campus experience when you were a student?
Yeah. So again, my undergrad was really small, right? And since we were not accredited as an engineering college yet, you can't be accredited until you graduate your first class. That meant we had no international students.
Oh, wow.
Which I think was really, not a great thing for global awareness, And it was, I just remember like, So yeah, I think that I surrounded myself in a lot of ways with Asians who were my friends in college, because I think we all needed that to kind of survive. And so it was funny. I was part of like the Korean club, the Chinese club, the Japanese club, and we would do all these like food cultural events in college because I think that a lot of my friends were really homesick and lonely.
Yeah.
Because they were coming from places like Southern California and Hawaii where their cultures had been the default. And then all of a sudden they're in Massachusetts surrounded by like white people basically. And we're trying to figure out like, oh, how do I keep some of my cultural identity alive? While also like being in school here,
Yeah. And were if you think about your best friends in college, the ones that you always were kind of hanging out with, how many were female and how many were male? I'm curious about that.
Well, I guess I'm thinking about like my roommates, which at that point they were still doing like same-sex pairings. So yeah, a lot of women. I was friends with a lot of men too, and it's like, that school was so small that we all were friends with each other. But I do remember there was a few moments where I really realized like, oh, these people are like not coming with the same understanding of the world that I am,
Yeah.
I think bird flu was a big issue in like 2005 or 2006 or something when I was still in college. And I remember that one of my classmates said something like super ignorant about how like, oh yeah, the US borders are strong, so they're going to keep bird flu out. And it was like, dude, you don't understand like how anything works. And then I think he made some references to like, oh, well, like these people in these like developing countries, like they don't have all this stuff. They don't have technology. They don't have this. And it's like, dude, you're talking about like China and Taiwan. Like, where do you think the technology comes from? You know?
Man.
And he just like assumed that like people who were not in the US, must be living in like a backwoods, low tech world. Which is just like, yeah, how can you not understand that like there's a whole world outside of, this country, right?
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah.
I wonder if this person found out
yeah.
what the actual reality was eventually.
Right? I wonder.
You would hope so.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah. And as far as becoming a professor goes, which is obviously in and of itself a whole story because it's just admirable to me, was that very stressful experience, I imagine, a lot of pressure, but was it an enjoyable process for you? Did you feel supported?
Yeah. Well, and so I think for me, again, since I grew up in Fort Collins, sort of my default identity has been like to be, an Asian surrounded by non-Asians.
Right.
That doesn't make me as uncomfortable as it does other people who are much more used to being, I think, in a very diverse environment.
Yes.
I think for better or for worse, like I have been in a lot of environments in which, it's like having a lot of white people as kind of the majority, you know?
Absolutely.
I think I've also been really lucky that the places I've chosen to study have been very supportive on a personal level,
Nice.
And so when I chose to go to CU for grad school, I had a great advisor, and then I've been very well supported by other like leaders in the school, which have really like validated me and like legitimized me in these various positions.
Yeah, that's nice to hear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I mean, I'm sure there's been like bumps along the way and stuff.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I remember the story about the elevator,
Sure.
and this might be a little out of context, but it really impacted me. So I would love if you shared that story, and also just like the background, like you were there on a work trip.
Yeah. And
in
so I think
Taiwan.
that like to help add context, so when I was studying engineering initially, I said, oh, I wanted to build robots, right? Like I had never thought I wanted to teach. Like I was like, oh, I'm just going to get my bachelor's degree and I want to work on products that end up on the shelves, right? Like I thought it'd be so cool to like design a robot that you could go out and buy at a store.
Right.
And so my first job was exactly that. I got to work for iRobot making the Roomba, the robotic vacuum cleaner.
Oh my God.
Right?
That's
And
so exciting.
It was totally my dream because it was like, oh yeah, this is the only robot at that point that you could buy on a shelf, basically. That
That's
was like
amazing.
a consumer robot. And so my first job was to move to Hong Kong and like work with the Hong Kong office that we had going across the border, Monday through Friday into Shenzhen, which is like this big factory region of China.
Okay.
Okay. And so my role is specifically to be like a liaison between American design engineers and Chinese manufacturing engineers. Okay.
Okay.
And so it was really interesting. Like before I went over there, you know, I thought it was a great opportunity because it was like exactly what I wanted. You know, I had just graduated from college, so I was like 22, and I was like, yeah, I'm willing to like move across the world where I like don't really know anybody because I think like why not?
Yeah, and I mean, you had what it takes to be that linking part.
Right. Exactly.
That's
Since I
the
grew up
thing.
speaking Chinese,
Exactly.
you know, and it was funny because I asked my bosses at that point, you know, who are going to be the like project managers and the people in the office in Hong Kong and China. I asked them if they thought it was a big deal that I was from Taiwan, you know, because I'm like, I'm going to be working with all these Chinese people. Is that going to be an issue? And they were like, oh, no, that's not a problem at all. Like Chinese people love to know where you're from. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not like, again, the average like Chinese citizen does not, I think, like, I don't think they have political like feelings towards a Taiwanese person, right? They're just
Right.
like, oh, you're from Taiwan. Cool. Right. Like, oh, you're from Hong Kong. Oh, you're from like these other regions of China. Like, okay. Anyway, what I should have asked them if it would be, how weird is it going to be that I'm the only woman working in this office?
The only woman.
That wasn't even
Yeah.
on my radar necessarily.
Did you expect that?
I didn't think enough about it going into
Right.
it, right? But it's so funny to me that like I asked about like being Taiwanese, but I did not ask about like, oh yeah, are there going to be other women there? You know, because the way it works in the Chinese factories. Okay, the women are the bulk of the very low-level factory workers.
Mm-hmm.
So the people who like sit on the production line and do repetitive tasks
Or women?
they're mostly women from really rural areas of China.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so in that sense, it's like there's tons of women around, right? But as far as the engineering staff, as far as the managers, as far as like the people who are in these meetings, you know, it was very male-dominated, I would say. And on a day-to-day basis, like all my direct colleagues who sat with me like in this little office inside this factory, yeah, they were all male. I think the Hong Kong office had one or two women. You know, one was like a admin, the other person was like a costing and sourcing engineer. You know, but I didn't have as much direct like
Contact.
communication with them, right?
Right. Mhm.
Yeah. So it's weird because on one hand it's like, oh, there's lots of women here, but they're all, you know, in a very different position in like the organization than I am, right?
Right.
And so the big thing is this led to a lot of misunderstandings, I would say, because frequently what would happen was, you know, and this was the life of a Hong Kong engineer at that point, is like, you know, most of my colleagues were married and they had families, even with young kids. But every Monday we would leave Hong Kong, you know, take a train for about an hour and then a car for maybe like, you know, 30 to 45 minutes to cross the border and go to the factory. And then Monday through Friday to sometimes Saturday, we would stay in a hotel just so that the commute was shorter so we could stay at the factory really late if we needed to, you know, because we were trying to get this new production line up and running to make new Roombas. But then we would often have American colleagues visiting as well, right? Because this is like a critical time for launching the robot. So yeah, there's always American engineers. Of course, all these American engineers were men too, right?
And mostly white.
And mostly white, exactly. Yes, almost all. One Chinese guy. A couple of Indian nationals as well. But so what would happen was we would go to these hotels, right? Because we would need hotel rooms. And it's funny because I realized, you know, repeatedly, week after week after week, you know, they would go through every person in the group, assigning them hotel rooms. And then they would look at me and they would be like, oh, wait, you need a room too.
Oh, my God.
Because they just assumed that I was there with one of the men, right? And it's like, because, you know, this also gets to another kind of ugly truth of that region of China. You know, the sex trade is huge in that region of China, right? It's known as like, yeah, because it's a big factory town, because there's so much Western investment and there's so many like business trips happening.
Right.
You know, that
So there's a market for it.
There's a huge market for it. Exactly. Right. And so especially being a younger Asian woman, being with a group of white men, and it's like, the hotel workers were just making stereotypes, right? They were just making guesses based on what they'd seen before, you know, and it's like, yeah, I think like many times a young Asian woman with a group of white men was probably there to do a different job than I was, right? It's like, I'm there to be an engineer, like I'm their colleague, right? But yeah, exactly. Like I was never thought of, I think, from the hotel staff or service staff, wait staff in these various establishments. Like I think they would always assume that I was an escort or that I was there with one of my colleagues in some capacity, you know? Yeah, and this led to all kinds of like misunderstandings, like awkward moments, and so like once I remember I had a one-on-one meeting with my boss, and we were at this like fancy hotel, he signs a check, but he like put something down wrong. And so I remember the server was like, oh, you have to tell your husband to like sign it differently or something.
Oh my God.
And I'm like, oh, he's not my husband. And then she's like, oh, we don't ask questions here. But that's just the truth of it, right? It's like they're just doing business.
They're just doing business.
Right.
They're just assuming they're making their best bet.
Right. Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And so then this elevator story I told you is another example of sort of like this type of experience, And so then also like the geography of a typical hotel in these factory regions of China means that, okay, so you have like a multi-story hotel. The basement tends to be the karaoke lounge, right?
Uh-huh.
And so a karaoke lounge means that it's not like the US where you have one big stage and people stand and sing in front of everybody. In China and in a lot of parts of Asia, it's much more common to have these small karaoke rooms, right? So that you get your own room, and then they have these hostesses that go around to each room and they're selling stuff. They're selling cigarettes, or they're selling fruit plates, or they're selling snacks, or in some cases, they may also be selling other services. Okay.
Wow.
Yeah. And so even like we were in a pretty nice hotel, but like the KTV still has like a lot of stuff going on. Okay. If you know what you're asking for, if you know how to look for it, you can get it. Okay.
That's wild.
Then there's other floors, your standard like lobby, your standard guest rooms. And then pretty much all the hotels have a Chinese restaurant, a Western restaurant, and a Japanese restaurant. Okay. Those are like the three things. Those are the standard.
Here are your three options.
Okay, so I think one night, and again, what was funny to me was like, I was always at the intersection, I felt like, of a lot of different cultures. And I think it was very hard for people to understand like my perspective,
Right.
Because it was like, okay, well, I'm the only woman here, but then I'm also kind of, affiliated with my American colleagues because I'm very American, But okay, also I speak Chinese, so I'm also like part of this whole like Chinese employee
And that was your
contingent.
whole role. I mean,
Yeah.
ultimately.
Exactly, to be able to like see both sides, right? And so, yeah, one day I'm in the elevator. I think I'm going up to my hotel room or something. And I think at first there is a group of American businessmen who like look at me and they assume that I don't speak English, which is really funny because it's like, I feel like I was probably wearing my company shirt or something that like said I robot on it, but whatever.
Oh, man.
Anyway, so then these guys are speaking in English and they're like bragging about the skill of this KTV host that they had. Right? To just be like, oh, did you see her? Like, oh, she was so hot. Oh, and you wouldn't believe like what she could do, and this kind of stuff, which I'm just like, that's gross. But like, I don't want to talk to these guys. Right. I don't need to tell them that I speak English and that I can understand what they're saying, that I'm like grossed out by it, like whatever. They get off the elevator.
So you just ignored it.
I just ignored it. Yeah, exactly. They get off the elevator. I still am going up. And then this group of Chinese businessmen get on the elevator. And basically, like, the exact same thing happens, except they take a look at me and they assume that I don't speak Chinese.
Oh, my God.
Which is really funny because then it's like, oh, why do I give off these different assumptions or like, yeah.
To these different groups of people.
Groups. But maybe it's just that they saw whatever they wanted to see in that moment.
Exactly, because that's
right?
the lens they're looking through.
Exactly, right? Yeah, so then basically they go through the same thing and it's just like, oh, like those moments you're like, how do I fit in here?
Right.
And like, what am I supposed to do about this? Right. And also even like, who else is here who can understand how awkward this is for me?
Right. Like almost it seems like no one really.
Yes.
Because nobody is in that position with you.
Exactly. Right. And I thought a lot of my American coworkers, I think, just assumed that I was totally fine. Which like, Janet, like you speak Chinese, like you're fine, right? Like you fit right in. But it's like, no, it does not work that way.
I don't fit in.
Right.
Not in this way, not in that way.
Exactly. Right.
Wow, what an intense experience.
And so what's interesting is like when I've thought a lot about my experiences in China, and then my subsequent work to think about like, oh, if we get a lot more women into the field, and like we change the culture of engineering and like do all this work, right? I still really wonder, it's like how different would it have to be for a young woman in my scenario who goes to this hotel, right? For the same thing to like not happen to her.
Right. How long is that going to take? What is it going to take?
Right.
Because it goes so deep in the thing.
Yes.
Like to change these people's minds, to change their perspective, their glasses that they're wearing.
Right.
Because that's just like so broad and such a big task.
Totally.
And obviously every effort is worth it. Every dollar spent towards this goal is worth it.
I mean, I don't know if it is though, honestly.
But I feel like I mean, I want to though, because I feel like even you, and maybe you don't see that because you're in it, but I feel like even you being who you are in the position that you're in have already brought so much change. And I think if we can think of one person's life that we touch, like sometimes I think about, with my dance company, like if I in a performance have touched and opened somebody's heart, then my work is done, because I've come here to connect, and you, I know, I've seen, have done that for your students.
Yeah. And I think that that's a good point, right? And it's, I think also setting expectations to be reasonable in some ways, because I know, like, I'm not going to resonate with all of my students.
Of course not. Yeah. I mean, we're humans. And we all
there's
have
some
our,
that are going to be down with what I do, and some who are going to be like, oh, this class is dumb, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, exactly. The few that really, I think, get a lot out of it and find a lot of meaning in like the way I teach and the things that I care about, I do think it helps them a lot to have someone like me in these positions,
Yeah.
But as far as like how much change does it take, I've had experiences at CU now teaching where I've had students who share with me like really horrific things that have happened to them, like being on teams where like men didn't trust their women teammates. Is a really common one.
Yeah, this is something I remember you mentioning.
Yes.
There was a specific story, and I forget which one it was.
Yeah,
a project.
I think I was telling you about a project team where, this team was really successful. We have this big class where they have this competition, and this team is 3 men, 2 women, and they won, right? They had a beautiful project. It like worked really well. Everything looked great from the outside, But at the end of the semester, one of these women, she told me like what actually happened on the team was that the men were really mean and that they wouldn't let the women do anything. They would like take parts out of their hands. In one case, one of her teammates like wrecked a part after she had worked on it for hours, and then the guy blamed it on her.
Oh my
She
God.
told me that she was so like traumatized by her team that she like cried before every team meeting, that she dreaded like every single part of basically this class. And she's like, I just wanted you to know. She wrote it all down for me after I asked her to, and she's like, I just hope that like this helps prevent this from happening again.
Yes.
Right. And very similar to my experience, I'm like, sadly, I cannot guarantee that this is not going to happen again. Instead, it's quite the opposite. It's like, actually, I know this happens over and over and over again.
It's like the lists.
Like the lists, yeah, right? Because this is well documented, like the experiences of women and sometimes like, marginalized populations on these teams, just because I think it's really hard to know what it takes to be a good teammate. I think, again, it's like college students are developing, they're figuring out like self-awareness and what does it mean to actually learn, right? And competition makes it more complicated. But yeah, it's really, I think, disheartening to say like, oh, wow, like I wish I could promise that I could protect these students, right? And I wish that like I absolutely could prevent these things from happening. And I wish that like I could give them all really positive experiences, you know?
Absolutely.
But I think it's also important to acknowledge the reality is like, oh, but a lot of you are going to struggle at times, right? And instead, maybe what we can reinforce is like, how do you ask for help, right?
Yes, I was about to say, how can we talk about this?
Right.
Like, we're not going to make it go away, but let's have a conversation.
Exactly. And I wish that student had brought her issues to me like earlier on.
I know, I was
right?
about to say, I wish she would have.
But I totally understand why she didn't.
She was so fucking scared.
Right. And I had a very similar experience to that when I was a student in undergrad as well. Right. And I did the exact same thing. I waited till the end of the semester, till after grades were in, because I was so like nervous about like, oh, well, complaining about this or bringing up this issue is going to make me look bad. It's going to make me look weaker. But yeah, and I was really afraid to ask for help about these kinds of things in the past.
Yeah,
especially because it was going to be like a confrontation of a type that I think is uncomfortable to have, But I think more and more it's like, how do we have those confrontations earlier and make them productive,
Mm-hmm.
Because in almost every case when I've actually confronted someone about like, here, you have been treating me like not equally or not equitably compared to my like white male lab partner, then I've had people be like, oh my God, I had no idea. Or like, why didn't you tell me earlier? Or like, yeah, how do we stop this from happening again? Right. And so I think the responses are usually good, but it's really hard sometimes to get there.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's like almost important for them to know, like, no, I will be welcomed.
Yes. Well, and I also think it's a different perspective. I think for a long time I was like, oh, it's about individual achievement, right? It's like I have to be able to manage everything on my own because that's how I prove that I'm like worthy of being here, right? And that's, I think, why I really was afraid to ask for help. Mm-hmm. But you can think about, but there's so many other ways to think about how a society should operate and how like a good team works even.
Right, and that there should be consequences
right.
for these guys to treat them that way.
Right.
That project should have disqualified.
Sure. Or it just is like, it shouldn't be all on your own to deal with this kind of stuff, right? To especially deal with something like sexism or racism. It's like, these are giant societal like inequities and structures of oppression that have been in place for so long that it's like, actually, it shouldn't be on one individual to try and change all this because they can't, right? And instead to acknowledge like, oh, the reality is we have to figure out how to talk about it collectively if we do want to make any changes,
right?
But I just think that idea of taking like collective action and believing that it's like a societal issue that takes, action on the level of a society, that's counter to a lot of the narratives of individual achievement that run through science and engineering, and a lot of like Western culture to begin with, right?
Right.
Yeah. And so like, it's frustrating, right now we're trying to hire people who can talk about diversity and who can hopefully be good diverse role models for our students. And recently I had some applicant, and in his cover letter, he's like, oh, we need to get beyond talking about like, Einstein and Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk. And it's like, okay, like I agree, we have to get beyond that. And yet you yourself stopped at name dropping those three guys, right? And I feel like a lot of people are at that level of understanding right now where they're like, oh, we have to do more than we have been doing. But still, all I know how to talk about are these individual examples of like white men innovators, And it just shows me it's like it's so baked into the culture of what we consider to be prestigious, what we consider to be innovative and successful. Right.
Yeah.
And so it's really interesting to say, like, how do we introduce new models for even thinking about this kind of stuff?
It's like we have to actually like introduce an entirely new paradigm, for teaching, for communication, for like what success means, what, achievement means. And I, having grown up in Europe and coming here to go to college, that drive that I felt immediately when I landed and went to college, and granted, the system is very different because in Europe, in Germany, where I grew up, university was free, so people took their time, and it was maybe also more about the community and the experience, and lecture halls are really big, and it's not like you get all the fancy things, maybe not even office hours because there are just too many students, but I really felt that pressure, like the drive, like what are you gonna do and what are you gonna pick, and just it kind of like ignited in me that German, control freak, and it's easy to like be torn into that current. I feel like in this country
for sure
already.
Yeah. Well, and I think our educational system probably sets people up for that belief, right?
Right.
And I think that this is a huge thing, to say like, oh, you pulled yourself up by your bootstraps. And again, you did it all by yourself. And that's what we have to celebrate.
The American dream.
Right.
It is like what this country is based on. It's so interesting. And like what the collateral side damage is like not as important as like the person achieving this thing.
Right. Or just thinking about like, what are all the invisible steps that it took for like somebody to get into the position that they're in, and for us to pretend like things are fair and equal when they're not, I think it's something that's really complicated.
Yeah, absolutely. I was driving down the street in Grand Junction the other day, and they have this huge billboard for job opportunity that they just put up, and a website to go to like, seek your career. And it was two people on that billboard, a white man and a white woman, and she was a hairdresser and he had a construction helmet on. And I was like, this billboard just got put up, but this is what we believe still. And it's just kind of almost like, for me, when I look at it, it's almost just like hilarious, like, why can't I be the construction worker?
Yeah, totally. Totally.
And why can't a man be psyched to cut some freaking hair?
Yeah. And so they've tried to do these different like public awareness campaigns, because actually a few years ago in like the San Francisco Bay Area, there was a software company that was recruiting more software engineers, and they used a photo of a woman who was like a software developer, you know. But the internet freaked out basically because all these people, mainly men, responded to this ad being like, "Oh, there's no way she can write code. She's too hot."
Oh my God!
Right?
You have to be freaking
And
kidding
so then
me.
this led to this whole campaign that was like hashtag I look like an engineer, which was all these women and scientists posting pictures of themselves saying like, this is what an engineer looks like, right? Like I am a software developer, or I am, you know, whatever, this type of engineer, even if you don't believe it, right? It's like I am, so like who cares? And why are your expectations of how I look, right, like more determining of reality than what is actually real?
Something good came of it.
But, you know, I think that it was valuable to like have that moment to say like, okay, have all these people publicly explain like, oh, this is what an engineer looks like, right? But at the same time, it's like, has that moved the needle of who we picture as engineers, right?
Exactly.
And who's in the news? And, you know, do we still think it's all the work of these like individual innovators, or do we understand that like, oh, all this stuff that's created actually takes a lot of people, you know, and it's mainly like who gets the credit for the invention. I think it tells us much more about our society than like, you know, what are these stories and how do they get, you know, the status of being true rather than just being like fables, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I was listening to a podcast the other day about the history of Yosemite and some of the like, you know, over the decades, big mountaineering objectives that had been, you know, accomplished by men, and how the storytelling in the essays of like women climbers doing great things were just kind of not talked about, but because maybe it wasn't like necessarily the first ascent, but it was like the first female ascent, or maybe because it wasn't like the first hardest route, but the second hardest route, but like we didn't hear about them, you know? And so this whole podcast was just, you know, really shining a light on something that I didn't think about, you know, what stories were told, you know, and how can we break free from that?
Totally.
It's so interesting to me because I feel like ultimately, you know, if I think of the next generation, you know, children growing up right now, what they're going to look at again is what they're going to learn, because they're going to experience, you know, what we create. So it's really just this long ass process.
Yeah. Well, and I do think, you know, different stories are being told now that are hopefully, you know, more representative of all the people that it, you know, it's taken to make the technological advancements that we've made. You know, and so like that movie Hidden Figures, I don't know if you've seen it, right?
Oh God, that movie. I've seen it twice. It's so good.
It's great, right? And it also just shows you it's like it took a long time for that story to be told, right? But it was very easy for us to like picture NASA, you know, as being like white men with skinny ties and pocket protectors, right? Because that was like the vision that was put forth for a really long time. But it's like, oh, if you look deeper, of course, there's this whole, you know, other group of people that were supporting all of these missions, but their stories were not told because they were easy to overlook, right?
It just reminds me of that comment that you made again. For some reason, it brings me back to that the classroom where like the white male starts talking about the things that he knows, pretending he wants to ask a question, versus like maybe a female in the back, you know, is not even going to raise her hand because she actually has like an interesting question or like something new. You know what I mean? Like, again, it's like that same feeling or something.
Exactly. Right. And we see it all the time. There's so many studies that are done about like, you know, when an idea is put forth in a meeting, you know, a lot of times if a woman puts forth an idea, like either it's ignored or people just don't like get behind it. But then if a male colleague like repeats the idea, then many times people will be like, wow, what a great idea. Right. And they'll forget whose idea initially was.
Oh man. Yeah. It leaves me feeling both hopeful and also frustrated. I think it's like a little bit of both, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
Would you agree with that?
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's like, I'm motivated to keep doing what I do as far as like teaching my classes and like trying to support students and trying to like make good policies and decisions about our like curriculum and governance and whatever, like all this administration stuff at the university. I think that a lot of people are trying to do better things. You know, and I think that at least the conversation around equity and talking about diversity and inclusion these words are things that are no longer as foreign to a lot of the people in academic land as they used to be. You know, I think for a long time, engineers believed that they could kind of ignore all of this messy reality that is like people in social science. But more and more, it's like, oh, engineers, like you have to know what's going on in the world, right? And a big part of me is just thinking about how we define our jobs, you know? And I think for me, it's like, how do I define engineering even has changed over the years. Whereas I think when I was young, I liked engineering because I did think it was like technical, you know, like you have right and you have wrong and you put your answer in the box and you know it's right, you know? But I now really think that like, oh, well, engineers, turns out we have all this power. You know, like we're the people who are designing these technologies. You know, we're the people that are creating these crazy robots that are patrolling like the US-Mexico border, right?
That's wild.
And it's like somebody has to also be responsible for the consequences of those technologies.
Right.
You know?
Like when students go in knowing what they're like designing for, like the army or the military, you know, it's like that kind of stuff too, where it's like, where is it going? What is it being used for?
Right. And there's all these arguments that are like, actually, engineers are uniquely qualified to understand the consequences of their own technology, right?
Of course.
Like they can't pass that off to someone else because it's like, you designed it, you built it, you should also care about what's going to happen with it, you know?
Right.
And so I use this robotic dog example in some of my classes because so there's this company, right? They sold all these robotic dogs to literally patrol the border. And their CEO at one point says like, oh, well, you know, it's not our choice about if we put a gun on the robot. He's like, we leave that up to people who are qualified to make those decisions.
Oh, man.
And it's like, you're the CEO of the company that made the robot, but you're not willing to take responsibility for it, you know?
Like how it's going to be used.
And then, you know, they try to pass it off to the U.S. government. The U.S. government saying like, oh, no, but it's this tech company, right? It's their job. And also, I mean, it's crazy. Like the CEO went on record being like, oh, we never put guns on our robots. But it's like, no, there's photos of guns on these robots, right? Which then you're like, there's huge consequences. Like who gets to decide, you know, the programming of that robot to know like, when is it going to shoot? When is it not going to shoot, right? What does it recognize as a threat? Right? What are like all the conditions that would lead into it choosing to take action or not? Right?
And it all comes back to money, right? I mean, really, because somebody that knows and doesn't want to sell this technology would not make that deal. I mean, ultimately, right? So it's like in some ways it's easier to say, I designed this and I'm selling this design to this other entity, but it's not my responsibility.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think that's also, you know, in a roundabout way, like really how we've gotten to a lot of the climate issues we have. Because it's like, oh, for a long time, the way we treated waste, you know, as far as engineering goes, like they were taught in the 90s, even in the 2000s, in a lot of mechanical engineering courses, people were taught that plastic was free because the cost of labor in China was so cheap at that point, and the cost of oil was relatively cheap, that they're like, oh, you know, you can basically at high volumes when you're making like, you know, your appliances, your toasters, your whatever, you know, imagine these kinds of like cheap electronic goods. The rule of thumb was like, oh, plastic is basically free. So make your parts with as much plastic as you can and little bits of metal, right? Because those are the things that are expensive.
Wow, which is like created this whole culture of just like shit that breaks all the time. It's so frustrating.
Totally, right? Or just not caring about what are the downstream consequences of all these things that we've been making.
And the waste that comes from it.
Right.
And because, you know, I feel like the flimsiness of them make it that so that there is more waste every time.
Right. Exactly. And so I think that that's changed, you know, that's changed because of economic factors. Also, I think because of the current generation being much more willing to think about the long-term consequences and impacts of their products, their designs, because I think they see it, right? And nowadays, I think it's really hard to deny that, like, yeah, our climate is changing, the world's heating, and what are the long-term effects, you know, and like, what is everyone's quality of life going to be like as we don't, you know, make some big changes here if things keep getting hotter, you know, and like, what does this do to all of these places that we love to go? And how does this affect like the outdoors and our access to nature and sort of like what's happening to all of these other, special like ecosystems?
Yeah, it is going to be interesting also to see like in what extent Biden's bill might impact that, because I know he definitely, you know, put money towards alternative energy resources and technology. So, and that's obviously also engineering. So like, can it start being directed into this like more, like I said, innovative or, like a new paradigm kind of way? That would be really nice to see.
Yeah. I think there's some good indications. A friend of mine just told me a story where he's working with an innovator who has a new like renewable technology for energy. Mm-hmm. And this guy got a bunch of funding from a huge oil and gas company to develop this technology. But it's all coming out of the marketing budget. Because this oil and gas company, they're like, we don't actually care if your technology is successful. They're like, it just makes us look good to invest a couple $1 million in this renewable energy project.
Wow.
Right? They're
That's
like,
the
we
reason
don't actually
they're doing
care.
it. They don't actually care.
Yeah.
Wow.
But I mean, because they have the money to throw around, right? But it's like their R&D budget is going a completely different direction. But their marketing budget, because they know they need to improve their like public reputation, then it can go into some of these, hypothetical, like long-term payoff, new technology kind of venues.
That do you think will be used though?
I don't know. It depends a lot on the specific one. I don't know. Yeah. But there's a lot of cool stuff like, new energy storage, new batteries, new methods of storing energy, making energy, creating it, moving it around. And I think that, it is going to take some like bold moves and some big choices, I think.
To really make an impact right now. Yeah, it certainly feels that way. Although we are sitting in Boulder and currently it's nice and cold and rainy.
Yeah, it's not hot right now, so that's really great.
There's definitely no sign of the heat right now, but yeah, let's hope for some major changes and on all these different levels that we touched upon today. And I really appreciate you sitting here with me and just sharing what I believe is important information and a beautiful story. And you just always inspire me. You've always inspired me. You have inspired me because of your strength and, again, your passion. And I know that you've made a huge impact, not just on my life, but so many lives. So I really appreciate you so much. And I appreciate you sharing that with me.
Cool. No, it's definitely been a pleasure. I hope that I talked about things that made sense.
I think they made a lot of sense,
okay.
And I think it's going to be really helpful for people to be able to hear that story. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think being an engineer is a fun way to see the world, but I wish that a lot of times we connected more to the world that we think we're serving, One more thing, very recently, people always talk about engineering as problem solving, but it was pointed out to me that even that definition kind of puts engineers at a layer of separation away from the people whose problems they're solving.
It's almost like a categorizing.
Right? It's like, engineers, like, fix this, right? Fix this for
it's not
someone.
Inclusive.
It's not inclusive and it's not together, right? So there's a lot of people that are saying, no, we have to redefine engineering so it's not like you're fixing this for somebody else or you're solving someone else's problem. It's like, no, you should be solving problems with people, right? Maybe engineers are just guides and facilitators because a big part of this has been like, how do we trust expertise of communities that may not have traditional, educational lines according to like a Western society, right? But especially as we start to do more and more of these projects globally, right? And how can we make sure that people are respecting local experts and understanding that there's many different forms of knowledge that aren't necessarily from the textbook, right? That aren't equations, that aren't just like computer-based, right? But it's like, what are the forms of knowledge that matter for how people are going to engage with these technologies? How are they going to change their lives, And so to think about engineering in that sense, instead of trying to like put it on a pedestal or put it away from people, but how to make sure it's always talked about with people instead.
I love that. That's like a perfect final message. I really appreciate you sharing that. I really, I think that is, to me, it speaks to so many issues that we're looking at: the inclusion, the communication, the not separating but bringing together. I think that's really what the world is facing right now. So thank you for that.
Sounds good.
Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. And please feel free to send questions, comments, and topics you would like to hear about to Isabel@kegelsandcoffee.com. That is ISABEL @kegelsandcoffee.com. Or you can find me on Instagram under Kegels and Coffee. Take good care, stay tuned, and remember, when in doubt, drink coffee or do Kegels.